An easy question sometimes begets beguiling answers, and this applies to oral care products, meaning, why are you using the product that you're using? But today we're going to address the specific issues with respect to that question, why are you using what you're using, as it relates to maybe tartar control issues, maybe even sensitivity issues. Okay, so we're going to
Okay.
be speaking very broadly today. Now, as part of this, I must have a disclaimer, okay? I'm not a clinician, and any recommendations that I share, that we talk about, that we discuss, are for informational purposes only and are not intended to be medical advice,
Yes.
okay? Now, these recommendations, though, are based on my understanding and research and just overall experience as an expert in oral product R&D, okay? Formulations, research, things like this. In this episode, then, let's talk about aspects related to tartar control, even things that can happen if you use certain products. That's also about the tartar, as well as sensitivity. Hello again. I'm Dr. Rob, accompanied by Tami, and you're listening to Dental Formulator's Playbook.
Yes, hello. So it seems from what we've run across, people don't fully understand why they're using the products they're using.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you are using something, if there is an issue, what can you do to change? Like where do I go from here now? Some if a
Hmm.
product, maybe that product wasn't even I didn't even think was causing an issue, but maybe after
Hmm.
talking to us or maybe even thinking about it, you're like, oh, maybe that product was causing an issue. Maybe I should include something else in my regimen or maybe completely abandon that product altogether. So that has been a very real example, actually, even
Yes.
more recently. These are just some of the reasons why certain alternative brands or maybe lifestyle brands, I don't know, somebody who's trying to promote maybe a less toxic, and I really hate that kind of phrasing, things that we have that we're commercially using are not necessarily toxic. I mean, the FDA
Okay.
allows a lot of these
Yes.
ingredients, toothpaste, normal toothpaste, that sold by legacy companies, those are generally safe, you know?
Yeah, I don't see people like
But
news of people dropping dead
exactly.
over
Yeah.
toothpaste.
No, you know what I mean? So, no. So, but that's a whole nother story,
Yes.
as we know. I
Yeah.
mean, we talk about a lot of different things in the show, but here what we're going to talk about are some other things. The elephant in the room, huh? Is there an elephant in the room?
Oh, yeah, we definitely need to address the elephant in the room. The biggest question then that you might want to ask yourself is why are you using the product or products that you're currently using?
Yeah, whether it's a toothpaste, mouthwash, whatever it is, there are nested questions whenever you answer that question, whenever you address that question, whatever, either one, that typically remain unanswered, or they may have more than one answer. For instance, what works for one person might not work for another.
Importantly, it critically depends on the why. Once you understand the why, then you can understand the what. If you understand why do I need a product that addresses my issue, then you can say what are my choices.
Yeah, exactly. So there was an example, right, at a recent AIOB conference, the American Institute of Oral Biology. We mentioned it in some previous episodes. Anyway, we became acquainted with one endodontist there, and he was using something different to clean his teeth. He wasn't using a standard toothpaste.
No, he was using baking soda straight from the box.
Yeah, that's right. Like Arm& Hammer's baking soda. So the whole stuff where you can keep your freshness in whatever cupboard or refrigerator, that's what he was using.
So why was he doing that?
Well, he told me that his saliva tends to trend a bit more acidic, and he has had decay experience previously. But he understands that baking soda can help improve not only mouth pH, but also buffer capacity, and baking soda is gentle. So all of that
Yeah.
is absolutely true.
Okay, but I'm sensing that if we're talking about it, there could be an issue.
Yeah, so it's completely safe to use, right? It can deliver a great result. I mean, heck, Arm& Hammer, the Church and White company, right?
Hmm.
That's with those brands and stuff. They have a whole suite of baking soda toothpaste, right? They've done so many different studies with it. They promote it as having a great clean, it's effective, it can be compatible with fluoride, all of these things, right? Good buffer capacity, fights the
Hmm.
acids that develop, after you have a meal, in case there are fermentable sugars or whatever. There's some other things that can happen because baking soda toothpastes tend to have more, or even just the powder, like what the endodontist was using. They tend to slant the pH a little bit more basic, right? A little bit more alkaline. And so because of that, there's going to be more likely risks of having tartar-like formations occur in the mouth.
Okay, I wouldn't have thought of
And
that.
this is what his problem was. Whenever he said, look, Rob, I'm using the baking soda, but I've been noticing that I'm starting to get more tartar. So,
Hmm.
but I'm using something healthy, but what is
Right.
this? And these are the aspects that aren't generally talked about, right? So you have
This is a guy
a
that
clinician.
knows
Yeah, he
teeth.
knows teeth, but how do we address that? What do you
Right.
do? And well, first of all, you have to understand that it might be the actual product you're using that might be doing this.
Yes.
It could be, of course, be your diet. It could be,
Hmm.
just your overall health. Maybe you're taking certain medicines. Maybe you're having a bit more issues there. Who knows? We don't know. But chances are, if you're using a topical product and you're using it twice a day, that's highly regular. Sometimes the diet can change. You can start to look at that. And if you know that your pH is changing in the mouth and maybe it's getting a little bit more alkaline, then maybe there's something there that we have to consider. Especially because some of the things that we eat are also alkaline too, and they can also produce things like we already know spinach, right? That's high in
Hmm.
oxalates. We're going to be talking about oxalates later in this episode, but why wouldn't that contribute some kind of tartar-like formation? Just something
Right.
that you wouldn't normally have. Anyway, this is all part of it. For me, using baking soda-based toothpaste, it's a little bit too much. It's a little bit too much alkaline. I get gum tissue irritations right away, just like I do if I have something that is way too acidic. Comestibles like that are an
Wait,
issue. Oh,
comestibles?
yeah,
Because I'm sorry.
comestibles.
I know it's common for you, but
Yes, comestibles. So comestibles is things that you can eat or drink. Think foods, candies, and
okay.
kinds of things.
Okay, I get
So,
it. Comestibles. Like which one specifically?
okay, so for me, from the acidic point of view, that would be things like pineapples, tomatoes, and even the lobes, of the oranges and lemons and
Okay.
limes, even lemon juices. It's even to the point where if I even have like some of those dehydration mixes that are like lemon lime flavored,
Yeah.
that can really just
Okay.
play hell with my mouth. So, yep.
If at least if you avoid those, then you're like likely to suffer less from dental erosion.
Yeah, that is the plus side.
Okay.
So absolutely. Yeah, anyway, so going back to the endodontist and the baking soda, what was the ailment then that he was suffering from? I say suffer loosely, of course. I should say
Tell
complaint.
me.
What is the complaint, right? That's usually how it's described. If it's a thing, tell me, what is your complaint? What is your chief complaint? His was tartar formation.
No kidding. So that's like buildup of mineral in the teeth.
Yeah, exactly. And how do you know this? Well, the hygienist will tell you because, or the assistant, or even the dentist themselves, whoever's cleaning the teeth, because there will be noticeably more effort that will have to be deployed in order to get that off.
Okay,
So,
makes sense. Just of note, using baking soda, while it might help the pH and
yes,
buffer capacity in the
yes.
mouth, so there are some potential downsides or negatives as well.
Something's good can also be bad. And then, there are
Okay.
factors in this, right? It's what your diet is, right? It's
Yes.
maybe the frequency of brushing, obviously what you're using, and then the duration in terms of, well, is this something that you've been using for 3 months, 6 months, things like that.
Okay, so your advice to him to counter this would be
Well, I would suggest adding a different toothpaste into the mix, probably something that has fluoride. Ideally, stannous fluoride is what I would recommend at least once a day.
okay. So, and everyone always wants to know. So, what
So
toothpaste do you
what,
recommend?
and so, well, in this particular case, for him, we know that he has history of caries,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he has some acidity issues in his saliva just naturally. And so because of that, that's why I say first you should have a fluoridated. And I think that's completely
Right.
reasonable. The second part of that is the stannous part. I like the stannous part because that can also help fight against some of those gingivitis related issues that could arise from tartar. It could. It might also be able to help mitigate some of the antimicrobials that might, or well, some of the microbials that might otherwise develop, as part of that, because all of a sudden you're creating all these traps, and maybe there's some, odor issues that can
Okay.
ensue from that. Potentially. Who
Okay.
knows? But I like the fact that stannous fluorides, especially, are in. Well, as you know, stannous fluorides are generally prone to having staining, and so one of the ways
Right.
to counter that is for manufacturers to also have pyrophosphates or some other tartar-like agents that can help remove some of that staining potential from the
Okay.
product.
That makes sense
And
then.
so here you're getting the benefit of stannous, you're getting the benefit of fluoride, and you have the pyrophosphates. Keeping in mind that sodium fluoride toothpaste also have anti-tartar technology in them as well.
Right. Of course.
It's just sometimes it's a little bit harder to understand what that is. So stannous fluorides, generally, if you're going to have a stannous fluoride toothpaste or a gel, it'll probably have some anti-stain technology and probably
That's good to
then
know.
therefore some anti-tartar
Yes.
agents already in there.
Okay, cool. So, if what I got from that is if someone has tartar buildup or the
Yep.
risk of tartar buildup, this means that the pH of the mouth might be a little bit elevated. Did I get the
Yeah,
right
that's
thing?
right. So baking soda can certainly
Okay.
do that. Maybe some other formulations can do that. And again, this is going to be exacerbated if you're already having a very healthful diet. If you're eating spinach, if you're eating a lot of salad, you're going to have a higher
Mm-hmm.
pH. And
Okay.
you might also have some other issues then too with some unwanted
Mm-hmm.
mineral, like spinach are high in oxalates, and oxalates can lead to some precipitations. We will be talking about oxalates later in this episode, but that is just an example. So all these things, but that doesn't mean that it's only the baking sodas or the pH that's at high. Whenever we say high, anything greater than 7, right? Maybe trending more towards 8, maybe 9. There's also other factors too, including products that have excess amounts of calcium phosphates. That can also be contributing to any kind of tartar-like formations that may be created in the mouth.
Okay, so are there other products to be aware of that have an excess of calcium phosphate?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So of course you have hydroxyapatites, right? And there's going to be varying
Okay.
levels, and not many companies are very transparent with how much that they're putting in. Whether it's nano or otherwise, the hydroxyapatite that's in there is going to be usually a company secret. But because hydroxyapatites aren't soluble whenever you mix them with water, they should not go clear. If you have a more
Okay.
of a clear, like gel-like formulation, you can probably understand that you probably don't have a lot of hydroxyapatite, again,
That makes
nano or
sense.
otherwise, in that product. One example of that would be Boca. Whenever we've tested their cinnamon product, it's like a gel and it's not white. It doesn't look like, for
Wow.
instance, a Colgate cavity protection, which has dicalcium phosphate dihydrate as an
Mm-hmm.
abrasive, which, by the way, could also be one of the minerals that is found in tartar. That one definitely more opaque, obviously white in color. You can tell that there's
Okay.
some material in there. Now, obviously, abrasives that have a higher level, and somebody might say, well, the hydroxyapatites are at 20, 10, or 5%. Even if it's 2%, you will notice a definite difference optically just with your eyes and just seeing what it looks like. Obviously, you can have SLS in there and that can contribute to the color white. And of course, if you have titania, but for those products that, are really confident in what they have, if it's hydroxyapatite, which we don't know, there's not really transparency about that. I mean, Boca knows how much they have, but they're not telling, right? But if there's other products, bioglass, amorphous calcium phosphate that's stabilized by casein phosphopeptides, the CPP-ACP, that could be as high as 10% in the formulation. That's a much smaller beast, and but it really can precipitate quite a bit. Bioglass
Right.
is usually up to like 7.5%. So
Okay, so
there's a
that
lot
would
there.
be another example then of perhaps too much calcium
Yes.
phosphate.
Yeah. And so that therein, might have great protection. It might have sacrificial layers. And I can understand that. That could be one of the strategies that a manufacturer or, group uses to say, hey, look, we have a quality product. But on the flip side, if you're going to have that, well, what if you don't have that sacrifice? Like, what if you don't need to take advantage of that sacrificial layer?
Mm-hmm.
And in the meantime, that calcium phosphate is just sitting on the tooth, and eventually it'll start to harden. It'll accrete onto
Okay.
the tooth structure somewhere noticeably in amongst the gum lines, especially if you're getting a little bit older of age. And we
Okay.
say this, you don't have to be 60. Shoot, you can have, gum recession and, even in
Mm-hmm.
your 20s, you start having these pockets where some of these minerals can start to develop. And then all of a sudden,
Accumulate.
that can start leading to an issue. So even if, you're like, well, at least it's there and it'll stay around, that could be the site for some unwanted activity.
Other bad things potentially happening.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what's another example then?
Besides hydroxyapatite, besides some casein phosphopeptides, I think that the CPP-ACP, the casein phosphopeptides, it's a lot to say.
Yes.
I think that that's a really good one, especially because there's two different versions and they're marketed differently. Well, with the different names, same approach though. It's either the tooth mousse or MI paste, or it's the tooth mousse plus or MI paste plus.
Depending upon where it is in the
Where
world.
geographically?
Okay.
Yeah. So the plus will have fluoride, not prescription strength fluoride, but it'll have 900 ppm fluoride. However, you can only access this traditionally through the dental office by prescription only, although I'm sure there are some online marketplaces where you can get access to these.
Okay, so
You're trying to
I
figure
think
that
I
out.
just heard you say 900 ppm of
Yep.
fluoride, which is over the counter,
Yep.
but you can only get it in the dental offices or through script, which means you're probably paying a different price point.
Yeah, so and they probably do that for margins, so they can charge more for the taste, and then it just carries on from there. But they were really promoting the heck out of this whenever they were the ones who were talking about etching the tooth, the undesirable stain or
Okay.
white spot. Oh, just etch it out, apply the tooth mousse, and look, it remineralized. When actually, at most, it may be stabilized, but it's the etching that removes it. Remember the whole Curadon? It's the
Yes.
whole argument about that
Okay.
stuff.
Yeah, because it's the acid etch that's removing it,
Yes.
not the actual product.
Yeah, now the follow-on treatment should be stabilizing, but unfortunately, just like the Curadont and the MIP, there's not enough fluoride. So whenever you're removing so much mineral, you need something that's going to be ionic and in abundance that will readily react with the tooth. I mean, the whole process, again, I think we talked about this in earlier episodes. It was pioneered in the 80s, right, with the microabrasion technique.
Mm-hmm.
That is what was used before all of these peroxide products became
Mm-hmm.
available for your own
Okay.
at-home whitening or even in-office whitening. So anyway.
Okay, so but don't they show like laboratory and clinical
Yeah.
studies and
Oh,
stuff?
yeah. I mean, they'll show some of these studies, but what's interesting is that they don't show too many studies where they speak on the actual strengthening of enamel. And that's quite important because if something is going to integrate really well with enamel, it should actually have an increase then in hardness, at least similar or higher, and generally higher if you're actually doing a better job of
That
strengthening,
makes
the
sense.
tooth,
Okay.
especially a lesion. Like a lesion might have a little bit softer hardness value, and that could be remineralized, and then that will end up getting a harder value, right? They call it the hardness number. Unfortunately, not all that data is assessed, and some like to use microscopic images. I mean, you can use an optical, just like a camera and say,
It
hey,
sounds
look,
like
the
they're
teeth
picking
look
and
great.
choosing what is going to
Well,
favor them.
yes and no. Yeah, I mean, there are arguments for that. And some people listening might be true believers of the tooth movement. Hey, that's fine. If the product works, then that's fine. But there's
Absolutely.
also, by virtue of the highest amount, there's going to be issues potentially with tartar. There just will be because you have that much calcium phosphate
Okay.
being delivered full stop. But the problem with some of these other images is that, and you can see it in the image. They'll say, "Hey, look, there's mineral in the image," but it'll look a bit turbid, a little bit, it'll be distinguishable from the enamel underlying, like the sound enamel. In other words, it's not necessarily enamel-like mineral.
It's not
It
integrated
might be an
as well.
intermediate phase and it might eventually transition to enamel, no doubt
Okay.
about it. But the fact is, it doesn't integrate immediately to create the hard acid resistant enamel like mineral that you really want.
Okay.
Fluorapatite, right? I mean,
Right.
this is the kind of mineral that
Which
you
is
really want.
acid resistant is what you always say.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want these mixed phases. You don't want octocalcium phosphate, dicalcium phosphate dihydrate. You don't even want amorphous calcium phosphate just sitting around because the longer that takes to sit around, the more likely that's going to become a problem, like a tartar type of mineral, than it will
Okay.
become a solution like fluorapatite or even hydroxyapatite if it, were to, integrate with the tissue.
Okay, so they do have fluoride in
Oh,
at
but the
least one of the
level,
products.
yeah, but the level is so very, very low. I mean, you have to dilute the heck out of that, like 100-fold to even get any kind of fluoride to come out of there. It's a very thick paste. The calcium is not protected from the fluoride. They say it's stabilized. What is this? What is this? What does that even mean, stabilized? It means
Doesn't
that
sound like it.
that the calcium phosphate is like frozen in an amorphous state, ready for eventual ripening to a more consistent, a more stable mineral. It's not stable from fluoride, it's not protected from fluoride.
Okay.
It's just frozen in time so it doesn't ripen. How does it get frozen? Because of the peptides that are locked onto it. In our previous episode, we talked about some of
Right.
this peptide action, right?
Okay.
These polypeptides, that's kind of the approach there. So that's right.
Okay. So, and they have a lot of calcium, right? Doesn't
Yeah, I think it's about 10% or so, but it's funny because I remember talking, this is going at least 15 years ago. I was talking to one of the original researchers on the team that was trying to gather all that data.
Mhm.
And all the data for some reason originated out of just one tiny area in the world. And
All the
you
data on the
know,
product?
yeah, I mean, pretty much. Obviously, it's, with the diaspora of research and the way it is with the internet age and stuff and everything else, everybody has access to stuff, products, communications, all kinds of things. But for the longest time, yeah, it was kind of sequestered in one part of the world. Data was only there and then maybe in some isolated pockets, whatever reason, that's okay. But in talking to the researchers, they'll even said, I mean, he even told me, he said, well, the original CPP, ACP that we were working on in the lab, yeah, it's not the same as what's in the manufactured product. So we understand that there might be some differences. And that was a surprise to me because that has never ever been made public. And now I'm just talking about it and it's my word versus whatever else is out there. But that is what was communicated to me. I
That
mean,
sounds like they're blaming their manufacturing partner for any
yeah, I think it
like
might be issues
bad
with,
things happen.
well, and again, it just talks to it. How difficult is it to scale up? That's why any
Hmm.
technology that is going to be commercially produced, there has to be a viable pathway for it to be done. And this is what we're talking about with the polypeptides that we talked about a couple episodes ago,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, we have to make sure that we're designing a solution that will be scalable because after
Absolutely.
all, it's just toothpaste, man. You the stuff shouldn't be costing an arm and a leg to be able to
No.
have. We're going to go through it and it's just not there. So anyway, so if you have a lot of calcium phosphate like there are in some products, then you are going to have some mass dumping of calcium phosphate mineral. Whatever isn't expectorated, whatever isn't swallowed will then sit in the teeth. Whatever isn't spat out will then sit on the teeth and just sit there and then,
Mm.
eventually maybe cause an issue.
Okay. Those are all great points. So I kind of bet there's like a follow-on story here.
Yeah, this is interesting because we had one commenter on one of the social medias. He had reached out, and so we had started an email exchange. He's an engineer. His name is Michael.
Oh
And he
yeah.
wanted to know, he's like, I want to know more about these calcium phosphate differences among all these toothpaste, and he's an engineer and he's a smart guy. But if you're not in this space and you're not familiar with it, it takes time and
And
you
the
have to be
companies aren't always transparent.
no, not heck. Even researchers aren't even transparent. A lot of researchers, they don't even know what
Mhm.
testing is required. But that's just the way it is. I mean, that's just natural, right? You can't be an expert in all things, right? So we will be talking about some more specific differences among those, but
Okay.
but right now we won't. Here we're just,
Okay.
yeah,
So we discussed the possible issues with tartar-like formations that can wreak havoc,
right,
especially with the systems
right,
that are lacking fluoride that might
right.
pose demineralization risk, like Live Fresh.
Yeah, live fresh, right?
Um, Maybe elevated pH treatments like baking soda alone or
Yep,
formulations with elevated pH, or even high levels of calcium and phosphate in the product, such as hydroxyapatite, specialized forms of calcium
that's
phosphate,
right.
DPP, ACP. I think you mentioned, does bioglass fall into this?
Yeah, so bioglass is among the worst for creating strong acid-like
Okay.
mineral. It just doesn't, right? Bioglass it kind of just looks like, just stuff that just sat on top of the tooth surface. If you ever look at a scanning electron microscope image, you don't have enamel-like mineral on there. It just looks like this dusting, almost like sometimes people liken it to a smear layer. Otherwise, it just looks like this just mineral that's just there. Of course, the argument is, well, it's a reservoir for future use and need of that calcium phosphate. I mean, that's fine. And, oftentimes it's used for sensitivity relief. That's probably where it has the best benefit because bioglass in general is not really designed for strength bearing applications, load bearing applications.
Okay.
I think some of the original bioglass was used in the ear to replace certain ear bones. Well,
Um,
there's not a lot of mechanical action there. You're not slamming your head against the wall too much where you have to worry about
I
that,
hope not.
right? But you won't necessarily find bioglass as being a principal component that would necessarily be there for compression forces like in the jaw,
Right.
right? You won't have it, in your gripping of your hand, like if you were
Mhm.
to implant that in your bone and like in a hand if you were going to squeeze. Those are areas where you're not going to find that. Now, could it be useful in sensitivity? Yes. Could it also serve incidentally, inadvertently as a source of tartar minerals? Yeah, absolutely it can. Why,
Okay.
why couldn't it? You're having a saturated level in your mouth, and depending on your moisture level, depending on,
Yeah.
when you're using the product or using it right before bed, where all of a sudden you have dry mouth conditions, and it's going to be even more likely to
Mm-hmm.
precipitate out because there's less moisture there.
Right.
These are some of the issues that can impact this. So,
Okay.
yes, so bioglass absolutely can.
Okay. So that's one for sensitivity. Sensitivity. So are there
Yep.
more options for sensitivity?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's so many more. So, yeah, there's going to be several of those. Didn't you even have bioglass treatments? I mean, we're going to talk about some of these other ones, but that just reminds me. Didn't you have some?
I did. Okay, so before I met you, I've always had a horrible history of
Mm,
oral care. I've had 7 root canals, I think,
yeah.
I've mentioned before. And so my dentist gave me bioglass treatment, which was prescription. It was expensive for my sensitivity, and it Didn't
It
do
didn't work,
anything
right?
at all. I tried Sensodyne.
Okay.
But it wasn't until I met you and tried some of the experimental formula. I was so happy I met him.
Yeah.
Tried some of the experimental formulation that you were working on, that my sensitivity actually finally disappeared.
Okay, so we'll talk about that in a minute, but going back to the bioglass. So, again, for some people, if it reduces their sensitivity and they don't have any tartar formation, hey, great for them. And
Yeah,
if, great for them. If it works, great. Again, not everybody's environment is the same as somebody else's. So there's no shade here, but there are potential issues, and that's what we're highlighting here. Before we talk about that formulation that I gave you, what about Sensodyne? Did you have any luck with Sensodyne?
moderate.
Okay, so Sensodyne is another approach that is used for sensitivity relief. And there is the OTC monograph, and they use potassium nitrate, at least initially, Sensodyne did. And that is where you have potassium nitrate that is in a toothpaste. Usually there's going to be sodium fluoride. In fact, potassium nitrate was then later added to peroxide based whitening systems. And then, of course, they also added fluoride along with the nitrate in the
Okay.
peroxide-based systems because of the sensitivity-related issues that
Okay.
people would
That makes
develop.
sense.
So again, sometimes it helps people, sometimes it doesn't, right? It all depends on the nature of what that sensitivity is. And again, this is one of the reasons why there are so many different approaches to address sensitivity.
That
So you
makes
have
sense.
bioglass. Sometimes people like the CPP-ACP. We already talked about hydroxyapatite. I,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's going to be a good one. I would probably say that's one of the least studied in this particular case. Potassium nitrate is very well studied, and the how that might work is that you have a surplus of potassium ions that develop around the nerve ending, and they kind of stabilize that so you don't have so much fluid displacement and you don't have these ions being slammed around the nerve. So, I mean, there's some interesting aspects there, but it takes a little while for that to develop. Now, that's just basically a numbing kind of approach. You don't actually have any mineral
Okay.
that's formed. So
Okay.
that's something completely different. And so the numbing it can work.
Absolutely.
But will it be enough? And is that the longer term approach? Probably
For some
not.
people,
It's
yes.
for some people, right. And so Sensodyne, even more recently, has turned to the stannous fluoride because stannous has been shown to have an even better benefit with sensitivity
Okay.
relative to, say, normal, like over the counter levels of monofluorophosphate or
Okay.
even sodium fluoride. So today, for like in the Sensodyne brand, you can get potassium nitrate, or you can have stannous fluoride. So yeah, so these are already a couple different
Yeah.
mechanisms. Stannous does build some mineral, but it doesn't necessarily look like tooth and mineral. But it'll have aspects of that because of the fluoride part. So you'll still have your fluorapatite, but you're going to start getting all this. You're going to get a hodgepodge
Okay.
of mineral by virtue of the presence of stannous. And that's actually been well studied, even as far back as the 1940s and 50s, back whenever the stannous fluoride formulations were being developed. Yes, so even though it's not officially cleared for sensitivity, stannous fluoride, it is being used for that. So anybody who is saying sensitivity relief and they have stannous fluoride toothpaste, you can bet that they probably have some clinical studies to back that.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I know the Sensodyne creators, they do a good job. They have great integrity, and they would definitely have clinicals to support.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
you were saying before you're not so sure about hydroxyapatite for
Yeah, I mean, you can get
sensitivity.
some good lab-based evaluations that can show maybe a nice picture because really that's what all this came down to. And the bioglass approach really popularized using the scanning electron microscope to show an opening of a dent and tubule. And the dent is the underlying structure, right, of the tooth. It's underneath the
Mm-hmm.
enamel. And at the base of one of those tubules is going to be, for instance, a nerve ending, for instance, that
Okay.
will have that. So the idea is if you have a tubule that has its opening closed, then you're going to have reduction in sensitivity because that nerve will then have less
But as
access
you've
to
said
the
before,
environment.
just because it works in a lab
Yeah,
situation
exactly. So
doesn't
So
translate.
they really need to have a clinical study. I
Okay.
don't think that some of the companies out there, like, there's like a David's toothpaste that has hydroxyapatite, and they say, oh, yeah, we have a lab study. That's fine. And that's a good start. But you should probably have a clinical study if you're making sensitivity claims, because again, that isn't cleared for the with the monograph
Right.
for those kinds of claims. It's funny
Okay.
to me.
Like what else can we do
Yeah,
for
so what else? Okay,
sensitivity?
so we have all of these other potentials and actuals that can help.
Potentials, actuals.
Let's see, potassium exolate is another one, as well as dental varnishes, like a cavity varnish. Now, in order to gain access to that, can't necessarily use the OTC monograph. All of a sudden, now you're going to get into an FDA medical device. Where
Okay.
there's a
I don't think we've
510,
talked that
we
much
haven't
about
really
that.
talked about that, but there is a mechanism in place
Okay.
for a medical device for sensitivity. And these are two unique approaches that are used to try to create new mineral or a
Mm-hmm.
new substance that will coat that opening to the tubule to block then transmission down to the base of that tubule, which houses the nerve.
Okay, so
That's
like
right.
you said, this is going to be much different than the OTC monograph, right?
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you'll need a much higher level of approval. There might be
Yeah.
a lot more scrutiny on
Yeah,
them.
and there is,
Okay.
fortunately, depending on the class of the medical device, and I believe this is like a class two, maybe class three medical device for the sensitivity, you don't necessarily have to run clinical trials. So this tends to be a very popular mechanism for getting potential off-label claims or the minimal amount of data needed
Okay.
to be able to have a device claim for sensitivity. And I say this very cautiously because there's a little bit of gamesmanship here, right? It's a little bit
Okay.
of creativity. It's important to note again that the FDA cares mostly about safety here in this particular case than efficacy. They care more about efficacy if you go to a new drug application or even an abbreviated drug application.
Okay.
And
Yep.
certainly for like consistency with the OTC monograph. But for some of these devices, as long as it is safe, in other words, let's not make sure that we're having soft tissue
Right.
irritations. Let's
Right.
make sure that there's no cytotoxic effects from use of the device.
Okay, well, I love that I keep hearing you say safe because that's fantastic, but not as much with respect to effective.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is just one of the pathways, right? So, and
Okay.
this is why there can probably be so many more players in certain spaces and they can like slip something through. I think there have been some more recent bioglass companies that have OTC levels of fluoride or not. They have fluoride free versions and they claim sensitivity. Well, they use the 510K device mechanism to do that.
Okay.
It's, I know it's one of those things. I wish it didn't exist in some respects. And then other times it's like, well, yeah, but it's a nice vehicle. And if it can work, it can work. So there's two sides of the coin.
I'll give you that.
In fact, I even helped one company who I think it's their first one get approval for a fluoride-free cavity varnish and they have a calcium phosphate based technology and, no fluoride, there. But I think ours is among the first one that was approved. So they were
That's
very
wonderful.
happy. But again,
Yeah.
you have to qualify that just
Yes.
because it's approved. What does that mean? It means it's approved for marketing and introduction, but it
And it's
makes no
safe.
claims or endorsements
Mm-hmm.
of efficacy. So I think
Okay.
that that's always a distinction that is not made manifest to consumers, to clinicians, practitioners, researchers.
And before I got in the
It's
space,
available.
I always made that assumption. If it was approved, then
Yeah.
it must work.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that to be absolutely not the case,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, I just want to make one thing clear. The varnishes that you're talking about, though, that's
Yes.
only available through the dentist, right?
Right. That's right.
Okay. So, and it has to be administered in office.
In office. That's right. Sold usually through
Okay.
dentists in office. Yeah. The other one that I mentioned was what? Potassium oxalate. Is
Yes.
that the other one? Right. So I guess probably the most popular example of that is Listerine. They popularized this because they resuscitated a predicate device that existed many moons ago, and where you use potassium oxalate in a solution, and that potassium
Okay.
oxalate reacts with your saliva, in particular your salivary calcium, to form insoluble calcium oxalate that precipitates out onto the tubule. It's more acid resistant than your
Okay.
traditional calcium phosphate
Okay.
phases, and that can then physically help reduce sensitivity through the process of tubule occlusion.
Okay, so that's kind of like the bioglass and the other calcium phosphate
Yeah, but
systems.
this is way better because again, the calcium oxalate that's formed is more acid resistant than the calcium phosphates from
Ah,
bioglass.
well, that's good to know.
Yeah, so I think that that is important to know. Now the potassium oxalates, it's somewhat temperamental. I mean, it'll be a more cloudy, turbid-like solution. So in like I don't, it's not Johnson and Johnson anymore, but in Listerine's case, they'll use an opaque white, bottle. So you
Mm-hmm.
can't actually look inside of it. You don't, it's not transparent like
Mm-hmm.
the normal Listerine essential oil mouthwashes, right? It doesn't look like that. That's because it has agents in there that it is soluble, but right on the cusp, kind of looks a little foggy a little bit, but it's ready for precipitation as soon as it hits your saliva. So that it almost acts like a prebiotic in that
Okay.
respect. Yeah, it's
Okay.
kind of neat.
Yet another way to address sensitivity. So we have potassium nitrate.
Yep.
stannous fluoride,
Yep.
bioglass,
Yep.
dental varnishes,
Yep.
potassium oxalate.
Which was also the 510K mechanism, but they released that over the counter. That's right.
Okay, that's good to know. Absolutely. And then are there others?
Yeah, in fact, you know this because you use it every day and you probably use it twice a day. And
Absolutely,
yeah,
at least.
and this goes back to I think what we were talking about in the beginning. So what do you use?
I use Klimpro 5000.
Yeah,
I
so
know I'm smiling so
I
big that
know.
you can't understand the pain that I was in before I used this
Yeah,
toothpaste.
no, again here for this is a disclosure to the listeners. Yes, I helped create this formulation through the functionalized tricalcium phosphate system that it utilizes. But that being said, we're not trying to have undue promotion. However, it does work. And I
It's
mean,
life changing.
yeah, for you,
And I'm not the only one that said that. We've had several people say that.
yeah, well, we have, now it's really interesting because the Climpro 5000, so again, this is a prescription strength product. It has 5 times the level of fluoride as a traditional over-the-counter fluoride toothpaste, and it uses sodium fluoride. So we're not talking about stannous fluoride, we're talking about sodium fluoride. So although stannous fluoride works really great OTC
Hmm.
and even better than sodium fluoride, when you get to 1.1% sodium fluorides just in general, all of a sudden all the benefits get better. So of fluoride, they just get magnified. For instance, if you have a 1.1% sodium fluoride toothpaste that you use, you'll probably, on average, maybe have up to 75% reduction in caries, new
That's really good.
cavities, incidents, relative to over the counter level, which is somewhere around 25%, might be 35%, depends. But that's a big difference just by
Yeah.
swapping out the toothpaste. You can also get more antimicrobial benefits, and then you can also get some improved sensitivity benefits.
Yes.
So, and I think that's what we're talking about here. So, if you can get better mineral building, if you can get some better
Hmm.
antimicrobial, and you can get some hypersensitivity relief, then why not do it, right? And so, 5,000 ppm or 1.1% sodium fluorides have become a really big deal. I mean, the market is there. And honestly, for anybody who's had caries experience, if you have soft teeth, if you have, I don't know, if you have
Hmm.
issue, orthodontia, if you have implant, things like this, you
Hmm.
probably already should be on a 5,000 product because that helps also rejuvenate. And like, so for some glass ionomers and some filling materials, sometimes they naturally like leach out fluoride to help protect the filling and stuff. Well,
Hmm.
they need to also resorb some of that fluoride. So you get that from the introduction of either
Okay.
fluoride water or
Absolutely.
even toothpaste. The fluoride can quickly interact. Again, it's the fluoride
Right.
ion. So if you just have more available, you're going to have more of a benefit.
Absolutely makes
Yeah.
sense. Well, for those of you listening, and I don't know if you listened from the beginning, I just want to remind everyone that you actually got into this business
Yes.
because of your own personal caries experience. Everyone, again, knows about my experience, but I have to say, since going, in all seriousness, since going on Clem Pro 5000, it's been more than 15
Yeah,
years, I
more than
think.
15. Yeah, easily.
I haven't had one cavity.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
I'm someone that every single time I went to the dentist, it was a cavity or a root canal my entire life. In 15 years, not one cavity,
yeah, I mean,
which
that's,
is amazing.
I had the issue, and that's one of the driving forces for us getting into this. Of course, I didn't know when I started research that there was even a 1.1% sodium fluoride option. So that became clear later in the course of research.
Yeah, you got
But
up to speed quickly.
yeah, but the calcium phosphate ingredient that I created here, it checked off the boxes that we needed to make sure that it met.
How
And
so?
what were those boxes, right? We optimized. Not only do we modify the type of tricalcium phosphate that it was, but we made it compatible with different vehicles. So the one that's in ClinPro 5000 is different than the one that's in the ClinPro Varnish, also
Okay.
known as Vanish Varnish. And then we optimized the level. We tried to performance match it to the level of fluoride. So the level of calcium that's with fluoride in a toothpaste is different than the one that's in the varnish. And it's even different than the over-the-counter level of toothpaste, fluoride level that's in the ClinPro tooth cream,
This sounds very
Yeah, it was very targeted. It was
yes.
very tailored. This is the first time that that ever happened. And so
Okay.
no other product does that. So that checked that box. So we got fluoride optimization. Is it compatible with fluoride? Yes. So that was another important one. Did it lead to increased micro hardness of the enamel? Did it make it actually stronger? Yes, it did that. And was it able to pull fluoride deeper into the tooth? Yes, it did that too.
This is the
And
tricalcium
so,
phosphate that
yep.
was able to do all of that.
Yeah, and most importantly, all of the levels that we're talking about are much less than 1%. I don't think there's more than, and I know this for a fact, there's not more than 0.1% of the tricalcium phosphate in these toothpaste. There's a higher amount in the varnish, and there's a reason for that. But for the toothpaste, it's less than 1%. In fact, it's about 0.1% or lower. So you don't have to worry about dumping excess calcium and
Okay.
phosphate where you're going to have an eventual tartar control problem.
That
So
makes
so that
sense because
yet
I've never
another
had charter
yeah,
problems.
you never
Okay.
yeah, I mean I don't have tartar problems
I was
either.
beginning to wonder throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah, so that's
so
fantastic.
those are just some differences. Now, can another sodium fluoride dentifrice have a benefit on sensitivity? Absolutely. It very well might. But for the ClinPro 5000, that has at least one independent clinical study against a positive and negative control. And there's been numerous reports of that for a sensitivity benefit.
Mhm.
So I know that's what we're talking about. And we have a colleague and collaborator from Japan named Dr. Makoto Isaizumi, and he's just a fantastic guy. He reached out to
Yes.
me
A while ago.
long time ago. So in Japan, they can't have over 1,000 ppm of fluoride into the country. So he petitioned the Ministry of Health, got approval. He actually had imported ClinPro 5000 into his practice.
That's a big
He's
deal.
an orthodontist. He got approval for it and he was using it since. And in fact, I even have an email from him that he said, I've been using the ClinPro 5000 since 2010 and it has been effective for all of his patients. I've never found a single cavity. That's him writing to me. And I have that,
He's an
writing. And
orthodontist.
he's an orthodontist and he uses it, and that had been really important to know. And of course, we published on this because he wanted to know more about the mechanism of action, and so I would prepare some specimens, do measurements, send them to him blinded. He went to like a national facility, did some really
It's
cool
very
X-ray
cool.
work. We have published on this in case people are interested. I'm more than happy to share those results. It's really interesting to know and to see that you fundamentally are getting different mineral. It's enamel-like, but it's stronger and it's more acid resistant.
To me, that says better.
It's a better form of fluorapatite. It's still a form of fluorapatite, but you're going to have some calcium phosphate there. And the crystallites are strong.
I love it.
It helps justify, I guess, the experiences that some people have whenever they say, "Hey, it's really worked well for me." So,
A lot
are
of
we
people say that.
stumping for the product? Well, no, we're just talking about what one of the differences are. And even though it has calcium and phosphate, it's not at that tartar level that
Right.
all the other ones have because there is confusion out there. And again, this goes back to even listeners like Michael, the engineer,
Yeah.
saying, I would really like to know what is the difference between CPP, ACP, and tricalcium phosphate and some of these other things. And we'll talk about that more in other episodes because
Okay.
it really demands it, I
So
think.
would
But
just for clarification, would
yeah.
other 1.1 sodium fluoride dentifrices
You
possibly
know,
work?
yeah, I would, they might. It depends, some might, and it's not just about having an ingredient in there. So you have to be careful about that too,
Okay.
right? Because some might throw in an ingredient that might bind up fluoride, or they might throw in some other ingredients that might contribute to more of a plaque removal and/or there might be some demineralization
Yeah, I
in the
love that
burn.
you optimized your
Yeah, I
formulation.
mean,
It was really cool.
these are things that have to be considered. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. Some other formulations can probably be effective, but we're obviously,
Okay, so it sounds like 1.1 sodium fluoride.
it could be. Yep,
Okay,
could be
okay.
an option.
So if I'm counting them correctly, that's six different
Yeah,
approaches.
there's a lot of
Um,
approaches. Yeah.
some build mineral, just
Yeah,
and some just desensitize.
just
Sorry.
desensitized. That's right.
But some that do build or contribute mineral deposits might also cause irritations of the gum line, is what I'm understanding.
Yeah, so I guess, that's all the takeaway from this, what you might be using and you start off with might really work well, but don't be afraid to pivot. Don't be afraid to understand, hey, what I might be using might have some off-target results, although generally I'm pretty good. Maybe I might have to introduce another product
And you can always go back
just
to it
cut
if
back.
need
And you
be.
can still use it if you need to, just don't use it as frequently because there's going to be some issues. Now, there's so many different aspects of this, and we're going to be talking about
Right.
this in one of the next episodes coming up. We'll have to talk about mouthwashes because the purpose of using a mouthwash could be widely varying. Do you have gingivitis issues or is it just a fresh breath or are they connected? Or some mouthwashes also have anti-caries benefits because they have fluoride in them. So that might be
Another reason.
another reason, because the water fluoridation issue wasn't always available. And so fluoride
Mm-hmm.
rinses came into popularity, especially in preschool and primary school
Mm-hmm.
programs where not everybody had access or
Mm-hmm.
availability of certain fluoride products. So again, the provenance of all this, it is quite interesting, but there's a different purpose for these products.
Makes
And some of
sense.
them have multiple purposes.
So let's
So.
talk about those products.
Yeah, not now, Yeah, but we'll definitely do that in another
Okay.
episode. Yeah, but for now, I hope that this was helpful. We talked a little bit about how some very healthful things can maybe lead to some tartar related issues and how that might be addressed. And we also introduced some sensitivity
Yeah.
related possibilities, whether that's some of them have a medical device claim or they're just part of the OTC monograph that's already
Hmm.
established. But then also some of it is off-label stuff, that might actually have some benefits. Now, could there also be bleed over and say, hey, is there good and bad benefits? Well,
Right.
sure. So we have to think about this. We have to talk about this more. So for now, I hope that that's helpful for what we just
Yep.
did. This is a lot of information I think coming, but I think it's helpful. So yeah, we will definitely talk about this more for sure.
Okay, good.
All right. So for now, that's it. Thank you for listening. We really appreciate your attention. Stay curious, keep smiling, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.